So I'm James Croft, known to most of you, and I'm the director of the think tank. I occasionally do a bit of research as well. I always wish I could do more, but yes. So last year I authored a report that some of you will have seen on collaboration, which I referred to during the course of this evening, on school-to-school collaboration, partnerships and informal structures in particular, looking at the nature of the claims made for those kinds of school improvement interventions and whether they really hold up. I've turned my mind recently, and hence this project, to looking at leadership effects, which is what I'm going to speak about this evening. I'm getting into that already, and what I need to do is introduce Daniel here. This is Daniel Mugis, Professor Daniel Mugis of the University of Southampton, Director of Research at the Education School there. Daniel is going to respond graciously, I hope, to my presentation this evening. I should say he's been. I found Daniel's work in this area to be second to none, really, and I'm not saying that to flatter him. When you see the report, which is out for anybody who's interested to stay up for us at about midnight tonight, you'll find that his work is often cited, and indeed it was a couple of papers that he wrote a couple of years ago now on research and leadership, and in particular on organisational performance, and addressing some of the shortcomings of the research in this field and the problems that it creates for policy. That got me into this. So Daniel, Daniel works at the University of Southampton, where he heads the education school there, and was previously at Manchester and Newcastle, and is published widely in the areas of educational effectiveness. He's also the editor of the journal School Effectiveness and School Improvement. And you don't follow him on Twitter, you should. I'm also, just at the outset, want to thank in particular the sponsors of this research and this event, One Education, who are here this evening. Here's Kieran McDermott, the Chief Executive, with colleagues Sean Pilo and Jane Salvi sitting behind him. Do make yourself known to them, and thank you very much indeed to you. Okay, so taking a lead, how to access the leadership premium. I'll put a graphic of the cover up here on the slide. This might be something fun for you to try at home when you get back before you, while you're waiting for the midnight launch of the paper. Avidly download and read it into small hours. That's actually a snapshot of a Google image search on school leadership, and you can't see it terribly well, but you get the idea. There's lots of diagrams, and this one's rather fun. A red fish leading a whole shoal of blue fish off into the deep blue beyond, and some others along here as well. They all represent different leadership theories, and anybody who's ever sort of looked at this, even in a surface way, and some of you, I'm sure, have at least done that, you will know that this is a very heavily theorized field. And that theories abound, and there's a lot of faddishness in those theories. We look back over many years of research, and so what I'm trying to do with this study is basically look at the research literature, we'll take a bit of a sort of an Occam's razor sort of type approach to it, and cut through to where the real quality research is, if there is. Didn't find a great deal, to be honest, which I'll come to shortly. And then to sort of distill some findings on the back of that. So why are we talking about the leadership premium? As plans for whole system structural reform have developed, much of the government's education reform strategy has, of course, come to turn on its being able to capitalise a leadership premium. Yet, despite the massive literature that I've just alluded to, that's built up around the subject, the convictions of politicians, regulators and professional development bodies about what leadership looks like and how it contributes to school improvement and what really counts. Is it personalities, is it traits, is it practices of leaders, how do we identify those? How to develop leadership, how is it related to context? The answers that people tend to give on these and the policy that's grown up around this are not terribly well grounded in the research, which is surprising because the school effectiveness research literature has in fact grown up very much facing the policy community. So those engaged in school effectiveness research share with politicians and regulators, the people that shape the strategy on leadership, a common set of assumptions to mutually reinforcing effect. But are they the right assumptions? First of all, good place to start. Is it really all about the leader? That at any rate is the rhetoric. That's what we very often hear when you're having conversations about school improvement. That's what we very often hear about the success or failure of the Academy's initiative. It's the most bizarre of assumptions in a way. It relates to the tendency to overstate the importance of leadership as a standalone factor in improving attainment, to the neglect of understanding how it interacts with other key school features. The tendency to overstatement of leadership's direct importance to academic outcomes is largely the result of adopting theories and research strategies that are essentially incapable of questioning it. In relation to the literature as a whole, few studies have actually attempted to quantify the contribution of leadership out of thousands. Those that have tried to isolate a number of studies that actually try to quantify what the impact of these are, literally are amount to less than 100. This is a common finding in the handful of studies that have attempted to do this. Those that do attempt to quantify the impact find that leadership variables are only modestly to weakly related to pupil outcomes. Yet this has not checked enthusiasm for theories of leadership assuming direct effects. Okay, so we're talking about the tendency to attribute improved outcomes directly to the leader. It's all about the leader. So are we asking the right question? The realization is slowly dawning on leadership effectiveness researchers that they may not be asking the right question in respect of the influence of leaders on outcomes, with an increasing and substantial minority of studies positing the number of school-related factors as mediators. So far, so reasonable. Though not without design and methodological limitations of their own, estimations of immediate, indirect effects of leadership work with the theory that leaders help create the conditions under which teachers may be optimally effective. Mission and goal setting variables related to the setting of the curriculum and the provision of instructional guidance for teachers are identified as important means by which they exercise their influence. Leadership matters for determining both the motivations of teachers and the quality of teaching in the classroom. So these studies identify. Now the importance of these mediators is corroborated in the economic literature also. The economic researchers come at this from a slightly different angle, but there's significant parallel. Economists looking at school autonomy have some very interesting things to say. School autonomy, the result of reforms to governance, often alternatively referred to as decentralised decision-making or school-based management. We've tended in our vocabulary around this to talk about school autonomy. In other jurisdictions around the world where similar reforms are entering, they use a very different vocabulary that is all about releasing the leader, creating space for leader decision-makings that is impactful. So in addition to changes to the leadership and management structure, the economic research also indicates that the scope to shape curriculum and instructional method and motivation of staff, specifically in the economic research through the use of appropriate paying conditions incentives, are important for raising academic achievement. In more autonomous school contexts, the importance of these mediating factors is accentuated. Yet problems with the underlying effects model persist. The research suggests leadership decisions as the sole cause of change still in organisational performance, a conception which clearly does not do justice to the complexity of heads' relationships and interactions with their staff, with pupils, parents and others in context. So considering these issues, some have begun to posit that educational outcomes and school environment are equally strong determinants of principal leadership behaviours, as principal leadership behaviours themselves are of educational outcomes. It's called the recursive or reciprocal effects model, and it has clear resonance with earlier contingency theories about how leadership works, which stress that organisational performance depends as much on the favourability of the situation for the leader as it does on the effective exercise of his influence over his followers or her followers. She said that the other way around. Substantiating this theory becomes more viable with the development of this effects model, with the availability of statistical tools for testing the notion of leader fit, and in what should be a more receptive policy environment. I'll come to explain that in due course. Now, the greater part of the leadership research community, however, still seems reticent to move forward with this agenda, in that the leading question for social scientists is not what works, but what works for whom and under what conditions. This should surprise us. It's a clear shortcoming in the literature. I want to speak now briefly to the theory-laden nature of leadership studies and what consequences that has for policy. Now, among the more prosaic reasons for this lack of attention relating to resources and capacity, it is also observably and undoubtedly the case, wittingly or otherwise, underlying commitments to different effects models supporting various research theories and reluctance to work together in the research community to develop a fuller understanding of the nature of leaders' influence in context have often not helped move things forward. A case in point, great man or heroic theories of leadership will be known to many of you. The history of the last 100 years demonstrates a reluctance to move on from that kind of theory. A slow development through trait and behaviour-based permutations of essentially the same thing, which locate all the impetus for change within the leader and attribute all the change to the leader. All of which are bolstered by the assumption of this direct effect relationship, have persisted in various forms long after they should have done, most recently in the form of transformational leadership theory, which has dominated the research agenda and discourse around leadership, and continues to make its impact felt today. Here, organisational success and failure is attributed to individual competence on the basis of virtually no evidence at all. With the vigorous support of their advocates, they have in turn exercised with their popularity an unhelpful normative influence on practice. This has been encouraged by a tendency within the field to pit different aspects of leadership, hierarchical leadership, distributed leadership, transactional leadership, collaborative leadership, for example, against one another. Hierarchical leadership structure does not preclude that you might also have distributed leadership within the same organisation, and very often do. A transactional framework does not, although it may change the nature, prohibit collaborative ways of working together. And yet these theories are set as diametrically opposed theories and coalesce great bodies of support around them, which you actually see borne out in the discussions now about what sort of structures we ought to be seeing, what the new academies ought to look like, what ought the leadership models to look like as we move forward into accountability, and has led to widespread over-prescriptivity in relation to what is at best a limited research base. Now, while there's some evidence of theory convergence around the leadership for learning model and increasing acknowledgement of the adaptive nature of leadership in relation to context, there's still too often a gratuitous preference for new theory among researchers. Meanwhile, best practice case study approaches involving interviews and the collection of documentary evidence and questionnaires, methods susceptible of a range of biases, continue to predominate in literature. Researchers are slow to collaborate and rise to the challenge of the kind of longitudinal study that would be useful in assessing reciprocal effects and gauging impact on school improvement. And further, researchers appear to have no interest in undertaking studies of quasi-experimental design. Daniel's paper was pivotal in bringing this to a number of people's attention. We surveyed the literature, 400 papers going back over a long time period here in research journals, and found very, very few, precious few, was it 1% or something, quasi-experimental studies, let alone no experimental studies at all featuring randomized assignment to treatment control groups. Now, these kinds of undertakings are crucial for leadership effectiveness research if it is to recover its credibility and move forward towards a useful understanding of the complexities of school leadership and what makes for success. Because of the over-theorized nature of leadership studies, the limitations of research design and method that have characterized the field, a theoretical redescription of actual leadership decision-making in practice, in context and over time, is probably a necessary first step to moving forward in the future. If it can be established, and this is the key question, if it can be established over time how far particular patterns are influenced by context or are constant, then there is a route to assessing the impact of those practices and to determine a more viable strategy for replicating what works in context, in other contexts. So there is, in short, a long way to go for leadership studies. Now, why is all this relevant, you may be wondering. That was my best effort, trying to make actually some fairly complex stuff and the relevance of it accessible. But it boils down to a few things. It's clear that we need to think about leaders more in context, and we need to think about them much more in organisational context. We need to also understand that there are a whole set of relationships at work here, and that very often environmental factors and other actors within the organisational context actually create the conditions for leadership success. They certainly are the contexts in which leaders actually learn to be leaders, very often. And when you look at the initiatives that have been taken over the last 15 years in relying on leaders to bring about system change, it's not difficult to see examples of how overlooking the contextually embedded nature of people's expertise has caused us some enormous problems. We did an event recently, which I certainly recall attending, at which John Coles spoke, and that was very much was specifically speaking to this issue of transferable expertise and context. And John maintained that in his federation, among his schools, there were virtually no head teachers capable of moving between state and independent school contexts. The discussion broadened out for us to think about independent school sponsorship of academies, which hardly has a very stellar record. And one could go on. So, policy implications to conclude. Well, firstly, we don't know enough about what particular practices are impactful, learnable, or transferable to require participation in leadership development programs. There is no robust evidence to support claims that professional qualifications make a difference to the quality of headship. In that it seems likely that emerging leaders are as much shaped by the opportunities and challenges of the contexts in which they find themselves, it makes sense to shift the locus of leadership identification and development to the school's level, to be led by head teachers in situ. Happily, this is broadly in accord with the trajectory of recent government policy. Moves towards the process of acquiring the necessary skills becoming more practical and work-based are also sensible. If school leaders themselves cannot identify potential leaders and design and develop opportunities for leadership development in school, there is certainly no basis for believing this to be within the skill set of central government and its agencies. Incentivising them to do so is therefore the right direction for policy. I want to just very briefly flesh out how we could do this differently. Now, I think the best way of incentivising leaders to take this baton and to think differently about leadership development is to work towards the development of a model of headship training and continuing professional development that is leader and demand-led. This should essentially consist of two elements: a head teacher shadowing scheme based on the observation of leaders in the school context, supported by, two, course content that is oriented to improving research literacy and building and refreshing knowledge of what works. Mentoring and peer-to-peer support will be provided by leaders of similar schools, according to demand from those in need of advice, strategy and support. This consultancy-based model would get around the misleading sense that an intervening hero head is in some way taking responsibility for the outcomes of the advice he or she has given. There's a great lack of clarity in this area. We talk about the need to reach out and to get involved with other schools, get alongside other schools. There's an enormous amount of both informal and formally backed initiative going on in this space, and yet it effectively very often blurs in the minds of the people involved who is responsible for improvement or lack of improvement on following that advice. This is effectively backed consultancy that wasn't asked for necessarily, or certainly wasn't chosen, right? The present government, unfortunately, more recently, seems at present to be set on reinvesting in hero heads and a suite of leadership development qualifications to be provided by the National College of Teaching and Leadership, consultancy around which is held forth in the recent white paper. This is in accord, I think, with its general countervailing tendency to override incentive-based strategy and take decision-making back to the centre, as witnessed by its ongoing control of the recruitment of academy sponsors and increasing centralisation of decision-making in respect of national education standards and assessments, regulation and accountability. This government has no other, under the auspices of autonomy reforms, has centralised decision-making. Quite the reverse from what we have been led to expect, but centralised decision-making on almost every aspect of school provision and sought to drive it from the centre. Now, in that, the research suggests that it is leaders' discretion in the key areas of change to leadership and management structure, motivating staff through mission and goal setting, and appropriate incentives in pay and condition, and curriculum, in the areas of curriculum and pedagogy, and consistent implementation of those decisions that counts. Centralisation policy geared towards accessing leadership improvement is not well advised. Such reforms threaten to stymie the potential of its school-based management reforms by taking over recruitment at the top tier and reducing leaders' scope to take decisions and affect strategies in the areas identified to have bearing on academic improvement. While the evidence base in this respect, as in others, is limited and far from robust with respect to causation, and researchers have a long way to go before they are capable of articulating in any detail the specific decisions and practices in context that shape the conditions for effective learning, it does at least give us the starting point. Without wishing to be too cute, to progress from here, though, what we really need in our leaders is the ability to attend and to follow the evidence. For our leaders, in short, to become followers of the evidence. Okay. So that is all. Well done. Daniel, would you care to come up and
sure.
Take the part?
Okay, so I've been asked to give a couple of comments on James' work. I'm going to keep that reasonably short because it's important that we have time for discussion afterwards, of course. So the first thing that I want to say a bit about is, well, even though effects are indeed modest and weak, that doesn't mean they don't matter, because indirect effects, of course, are important as well. As James said, leadership is primarily about creating conditions under which teachers can be effective. That's a pretty important role in the education system. So it may not be the strongest effect, that doesn't mean it's meaningless. We know from both research and practice that it is not a given that a leader who has been successful in one particular organisation can replicate that in another organisation. I was reminded of that very strongly this morning as I went up to the University of Leicester to do some external examining, and of course I see a big picture of the local hero leader of the moment, the manager Claudio Ranieri, who led his team to the championship. The same heroic leader who was previously sacked as manager of the Greek national team for not only failing to qualify them for the European Championship, but for managing to lose twice to the Faroe Islands in the process. Faroe Islands is even smaller than Iceland. That, I think, is a good illustration of the need to have that right mix of leaders and context. Success in one context, failure in another, quite starkly illustrated here. And we have many other examples of that. We have a lot of other research on that. So why do we keep persisting then with this model of the individual hero leader? There are probably a number of reasons for that. One is that it fits very well with human psychology, and in particular with what we can call attributional biases. The idea that we tend to attribute positive things to ourselves and negative things to external factors. Again, that's something that you see quite a lot when you do leadership research. Another example from some of my own research is at one point we did a number of surveys of leaders in further education colleges, and we were asked to look at leadership across the college, so from the principal down senior leaders, middle leaders and staff. And we were asking specifically to look at, yes, transformational and distributed leadership. This was in the heyday of the National College, those were very big things at the time. And what do we find? Well, my leadership is distributed and transformational. But my line manager, that bastard is totally transactional and hierarchical and top-down in the way he or she does it. So that is a very typical example of this attributional bias. Likewise, I once spent a whole day interviewing leaders in a school in a former coal mining area of the country. We were asked to find schools which had improved very much in these obviously disadvantaged areas and see how they've done it. So I get a whole lot of interesting information about what the head teacher has done, all the improvements put in place, very good stuff. I have some time to catch my bus back to the city, so I go for a walk around the village and I see, okay, this is the usual kind of old coal mining houses, but then I walk a bit further, I see this massive new Barrett's Home executive housing estate on the edge of the village. So I go back and say, okay, tell me about that. And they say, well, yeah, we have had a bit of a change in intake in our school, and that maybe also has made a difference. So always beware attributional bias. Also, a problem with that is, of course, the story of somebody who comes in and turns something around is a nice story to hear, a nice story to read. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. We know there are plenty of examples of leaders who have done that, but you cannot necessarily replicate that to different contexts, and you also cannot replicate that at a system-wide level. We have 22,000 schools in England. We are not going to find 22,000 hero leaders, not even in Avengers head teachers or something. So contingency matters. Now, of course, when you're talking about contingency and the fact that the match of leader and context is important, and what the context brings as much influence as leadership as the other way around, we do have to be careful that we don't go down the kind of rabbit hole of saying everything is so individual that we can't ever know anything. I would say that that is too simplistic a view as well. We can find patterns of behaviour, patterns of practice that translate at least across similar contexts. So I would say contingency, yes, but more than contingency, what we need to try and look at is differential effectiveness of leadership, where we try and develop typologies. One example of that is some work that my colleague Chris Chapman did, looking at schools at different levels of their trajectory in terms of improvement, where he found that, well, if a school is in big trouble, a failing school, then actually what you need is probably some pretty top-down strategies to pull it up out of the mire. Once the initial improvements has happened, then you need to do something very different, and that may actually mean you need a different leader. So looking at those kind of typologies, trying to develop forms of leadership matched to particular types of school, I think, and the end for policy is probably more helpful than just to say everything's dependent on the context. So that's one thing with regards to contingency. The second thing to say is, of course, if we are saying leadership matters less than certain other things, we can, of course, ask ourselves a question, then why are we spending so much time and effort focusing on this particular thing and not on the variables that appear to matter more, and that in particular is, of course, the teachers. Because what we find very consistently in our research is that it is what the teacher does in the classroom that has the single greatest effect on outcomes, other than what obviously the child, her or himself, brings to the situation. So another question for me to policy would be, okay, why don't we try and look more at the directly intervening in that particular area rather than concentrating so much on the leadership and governance level? Are we focusing on the right thing? Also, the issue there that you have with leadership, as well as the attributional biases, the issue of fit with context, is the question of what are we actually trying to achieve as leaders. In James' report, you will see there's also something about the tendency to equate leadership with change. And that's very strong in the literature and in the theories that you read about. Now, Of course, often that's very important and we need change, but not always. Sometimes change can be harmful. And what you see is that because people have been kind of educated to assume that if I am a good leader, I need to make changes, you can actually see people go into a school and undoing good work that has previously been done a little bit for the sake of it. So I would kind of say leadership, the first principle maybe is do no harm, and then think about what actually needs to change. Also, when you start looking at leadership as something that is vested in the person, you very often have the problem of what happens after that person leaves. And again, what we see happening relatively frequently is that you see a leader making very significant improvements in a school, leaving, maybe to work for National College or to become an advisor. Or, I'm sure you cannot think of any examples of that. But what you can then sometimes see is that the school actually starts to fall back into the trouble it previously has. So again, a question that I would have is, if you're saying, what is good leadership, is that not as much as about what happens when I am gone as to what happens when I am actually there? So if you are looking at leadership development, you need to think also about, very strongly about, how are we going to build in systems that allow for effective succession afterwards. You don't want to end up like Alex Ferguson at Manchester United. So when you then move to the policy, indeed there are clearly issues with having a centralised provision. We obviously developed that system a while ago in England, the days of the National College for School Leadership, National Professional Qualification for Head Teachers, etc. The issue there is that there is not really much evidence, either positive or negative, of what the outcome of that was. So I'm not saying that didn't work, but I don't know. I don't know whether it worked or whether it did not work. That's the problem. The thing that I know it worked in very well is that it did inculcate a knowledge of the theories in head teachers, which was quite annoying as a researcher, because every time you went and did some research, you just got the National College's handbooks regurgitated back at you. So certainly they could talk the talk. Whether that had an impact in practice is a question we don't know, and that's one of the big problems in research as well. We need, if we are going to focus on leadership development, have some more rigorous studies about what actually the impact of that leadership development is, and go well beyond asking people what they think was useful or what they like, because that doesn't necessarily equate to impact. It's a prerequisite. If I find my training has been unhelpful and useful, then I'm not going to change anything, obviously, but it is not a given that because I've enjoyed something or thought it was useful, that it will therefore impact on my practice, impact in a useful way on what happens in my organization, and ultimately on the learning outcomes of my pupils. So that's a major question. Decentralization, and I'm giving you a little pushback here as well, also has its problems, of course, because the risk that you run if you have a system led purely by schools and head teachers is that if you're not careful, you can end up in a bit of a cocoon, you can end up a bit in an inwards-looking situation whereby all you learn is what already is happening in that particular school or with that particular leader. And of course, when we are saying contingency matters, a corollary of that is that as schools change, as societies change, maybe the leadership that always worked in the past will no longer work in the future. So there's a question, if we have that kind of system, is how are we going to broaden the vision of our leaders sufficiently so that they know more than just what is happening in my school. I think that is all I wanted to say immediately, so we have plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Okay, well, we're going to sort of just do this in a sort of informal discussion type way. So what we want is to hear from you. Reactions, thoughts. Yes, Joe.
Yeah, hi, Joe Logan, Educational Governance Consultant, ex-head of Governance at Oasis Academies. In your research and the publication you've done, James, did you find any particular evidence or evidence, thoughts, opinions in terms of the role of governors, how they can help to ensure that leaders are developed in the schools, not just, if you like, a hero head teacher or the head teacher who's there, but middle leaders and, as the point was made, future heads of that school and future middle leaders for that school.
Okay, thanks. Loic?
Yeah, I'm interested in where you talked about the danger of re-centralising leadership development and so on, and that it needs to remain at the school level. I'm wondering how we deal there with the issue that there's been when it comes to things like schools direct, whereby the most effective schools are able to train the teachers, but then they get the first dibs on the good teachers, and then the struggling schools often find it harder then to get those new teachers. How do we deal with those kind of potential inequalities, and is there not a role there for some kind of coordination, not at the local school level?
Thanks. Other comments? Questions? Yes?
Roger Layton, I'm Chief Executive of Multi-Academy Trust in East London. You talked about the centralised approach or the school-based approach, but it's the maths level approach that's going to be the way of the future, one way or another, isn't it? And my interest here is that continuum we're already seeing developing of maths in their approach to autonomy and leadership. At the one end, you get you're the Tesco's branch manager as the head, following head office rules, and on the other, a much looser approach, and how that continuum fits into leadership development moving forward.
Okay. Yes, take on one.
I'm really interested in this. So it's Joe, I'm an independent consultant. I'm really interested in the language that's used about this. So not long ago I went to a Guardian event where they surveyed over 30,000 teachers, and 16% of those surveyed wanted to be head teachers. Now that figure really shocked me actually, but I recognised it from my own experience. At the same time, I used to work for Teach First, and their message about leadership is incredibly seductive. The moment you get young people in front of you and you say, you're going to be a leader, that's an extremely seductive message. And I wondered, I wrote an article for the TS about it after I came out, and I wondered whether there's the scope to completely rethink who runs schools. I've worked in the independent sector, and the traditional academic head, who is leading the common room, makes absolute sense. Doesn't make much sense in the state sector. And I really do wonder whether it's time to take the word out and think about different terms and different ways of thinking about the job, the job description.
Okay. I'll try and give a few comments. Yes, I mean, I sort of go back and forth on the issue of, previous sort of talking about, do we need qualified, formerly qualified people who come out of the teaching profession to lead our ventures. And this is a particularly relevant question for Matt CEOs, I think, probably. I mean, I go back and forth on it. In principle, I think yes, but two things. One is that it does appear that, well, it stands to reason in a sense, but the literature does suggest that actually where a head teacher can be really impactful is actually one of the key areas of design, or of organisation and creating the conditions for success is precisely curriculum and pedagogical interventions. And I think that taking those decisions with credibility is quite difficult, really, for someone who's coming out of the profession. So I tend to sort of come full circle to that. And I guess some of the other points related to that is precisely that, it's credibility of the leader is the issue. And it seems to be a requirement in the eyes of most people in the profession. So there are some that are now coming in to take on that CEO role in particular. And I don't think we should be closed off to it. I think there are always exceptions to the rule, but we can't make policy around, specifically around exceptions. So other questions on governance. I mean, yes, I did talk in the report a bit about about the research on autonomy reforms, variously described as school-based management or decentralising decision making. And in this respect, your question's a very pertinent one. We do have actually some quite good research employing good sort of match methods sort of approaches on fairly long panel data looking at academies, which Daniel here has been very much involved with Chris Chapman as well, which I wrote about in my collaboration report. And effectively the conclusion there is that the more formal and consolidated the leadership and management structure, the more rationalised and thought through and focused on outcomes that you have, there's a relationship to achievement, academic achievement, which in a sense stands to reason. The flip side of that is that the more informal the structure, they tend to be partnerships between schools, governance within those kinds of situations is quite difficult and lacking in focus very often. So I think that is probably a key lesson. What do you want to say?
Okay, yeah, in terms of research on governance, there have been a number of studies that look specifically at governors and how they fulfill their role and how more or less effective that is. Some of the studies now are a little bit older, so one of the problems that you do have is that they tend often still to be framed within a predominantly local authority context rather than in the emerging context that we have now, which obviously makes some of the conclusions less apt. However, those studies have found that there can be a significant impact of governance, but that it is a very mixed picture indeed. I think one of the people to look at that is that there was a big report published around about, I think, 2008 by Alan Dyson around governance. That's, yeah, and the other one was, what was it?
I think I want to speak to Levick's question about re-centralisation and whether you need to have a coordinated effort to address leadership deficits, which are very often likely to occur in areas where there is high need and high obligation. Roughly, yes?
Yeah.
Want to expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, I guess it's a question of if we rely purely on individual schools to do it, then some of them are doing it for the needs of that particular school. What happens to the schools which don't necessarily have the capacity to do that and are not being able to do it? Do we end up in a situation where you get an extra leadership advantage in those competent schools and nothing to then provide the leaders for the other schools?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and I think clearly the government set forth their strategy for this, which is that the shape of the future is very much that the expectation that individual schools will join larger structures and that therefore that will make up for the leadership deficit. But there's obviously an implementation lag. Whether that will entirely ever be sufficient, it's likely in the process of being introduced to introduce disparities and potentially accentuate the ones that are already there. Then I don't have a clear answer to that at this point. What do you think, Dan?
I think it's a good question because what you do see is that there is a relationship between the impact of leadership, the amount of autonomy schools have, and the variation between schools at the system level. So where we say we find an effect of leadership. That's not true in all countries. In some places you don't find an effect of leadership at all, and that's usually simply because the schools don't have autonomy, so therefore what does a leader do? Basically implement what the ministry tells them to do, yes? So what you tend to find also is when you look at school effectiveness is that the variance, the difference between schools in outcomes is smaller where things are more centralised. So when you look at a country like, say, Singapore, where the ministry decides who teaches in what schools, for example, you get relatively small differences between schools taking into account intake relative to systems with greater levels of autonomy. Now, is that a good or a bad thing? That's of course a different question, because you can create smaller variations in two ways. You can push at the bottom, but you can also pull down the top. So that is in part a judgment call as to what you want to do there. If you can push at the bottom, great, but in many cases what you see is less variation. That is also related to both less bad and less good schools. An example of that within Europe, it would be in a lot of southern European countries, places like Cyprus, where you find very little leadership effect, relatively small school effects, but not necessarily overall a high quality system. So yes, it's a good question, and I think you are right to say that there is a real risk indeed that we will get a reinforcing of the differences related to the existing capacity of schools. I think that's true. That's actually also somewhat related to the issue you mentioned with regards to the spectrum of maths and the extent to which within a maths schools have autonomy. And indeed, what you will find down again is where individual schools have little autonomy within a math. That will make the role of the principal of those schools a very different one to schools where the central function is much more limited. Of course, that will have implications for what leadership development you need. It also has implications with regards to this question of, do you need teachers to be principals all the time? Because that actually depends on how you define the role of a head teacher or principal. And I think maybe one of the problems that you get is, if you're not careful, the role of the principal can become too broad. So autonomy, that's a good thing, but if you are giving schools autonomy in various areas, it doesn't necessarily make sense then to continue with just having one leader who is responsible for all those different things. So is the same person necessarily best suited to both be an instructional leader, to be an HR manager, to be a finance manager? Well, probably not. So my view would be there that in a more autonomous system you probably need a diversification of leadership functions, just as you have in other organisations.
Yes.
Katie Dibble, Associate Director for Impact at the Future Leaders Trust. So we run leadership development programs for families, so I think you're probably familiar with that. And essentially our original program was government funded and designed to get people into headship quicker. Now, one of the challenges we see is that as an individual school, you're not incentivised to develop someone for headship because you could lose a very strong assistant head or deputy head. And so if you are going to give that responsibility to schools, then certainly in the short term, where someone not in multi-academy trusts, how do you incentivise them to actually develop someone out of their school? In the longer term, if multi-academy trusts take that role and incentivise it because they see a larger development structure where they can retain someone, does that mean that we accept that the multi-academy trust is the context in which you're developing the leader? Because the other challenge we see is that they may develop leaders that are very functional in their own trust, but who wouldn't be transferable elsewhere.
Deborah?
I wanted to make an observation and ask a question. I spent recently, a couple of years ago, I spent a period of time working internationally for a group of 45 schools, working in 16 different countries, teaching British curriculum. We had control over all of the leaders, and therefore it's kind of interesting in terms of recruiting our heads around, and we could recruit heads in. We came to the conclusion that there were 3 different dimensions that we were looking at. and they reflect to some extent the things that you were saying. One was the stage of development of the school. So we identified 3 stages. One was startups. Some people graded startups. The second was turnarounds. Some people graded that. And the third was finessing. And actually different people, different skill sets were needed for those different things. And so even though one head said to me after doing 4 different turnarounds, I want to be in one of those really great schools that's kind of just a flagship school. And basically, he just wasn't really cut out for it. So that was one dimension. The second was, as you say, the location, fitting the community in a place. And some people just fit the community much better than other people. It's stylistic and it's hard to pinpoint quite what that might be. So it was the state of the school, the place in question, and then the question of their style of leadership. So that didn't seem to matter so much, although different people have different styles. You could have distributed leadership in the turnaround situation or in the finessing situation. It was in the hands of the person in question. But I think one of the things we thought, and the reason I think it's relevant is because it's about the same time as some of the bigger maths, and we had made the decision not to have a cookie cutter kind of approach. We wanted our people to figure stuff out, and that was the overarching thing, that whatever place you're in and whatever stage it's to be able to figure it out, figure what to do. But I want to make 2 quick other comments. One was to say that we found that when you grow in your own, leaders with particular types of characteristics value those characteristics in other people. They don't necessarily value the other set of characteristics. So, if you are a turnaround head and you're quite authoritative and you get stuff things done, then you might not actually find the person who is really reflective and likes to tinker with the small changes. Quite sort of in person, in fact, you might find quite annoying. Whereas if you've got them in a finessing environment, that's precisely what you need. So how do you grow the other kind of leader in your kind of environment? And then just one other thing. I was reading recently a piece about CEOs, and after all, in decentralised systems, a head is close to being the CEO. And it was pointing out that CEOs lose their effectiveness after 5 years. And I was struck by the analogy in terms of thinking about schools, because the reasons that were given for why they lose their effectiveness was that they developed a relationship with their board whereby the board no longer challenges them quite as effectively as it was in the past years. The kind of people underneath are in a difficult position in terms of challenge and set routines come into play where it's the dynamics of the school are then difficult to break, and even on the parallel, it's difficult to challenge. So the reason that was being cited was that CEOs become less effective after 5 years. And of course, they cannot be effective and are not effectively challenged from any direction. And I just wondered whether you think that how long can you be, how long, is there any research, is it an interesting dimension, is it relevant, does duration have any impact on it?
You're raising the eyebrows of our sponsors, so
I feel the next paper coming up.
Yes, thank you very much. Bruce, if you want to say something.
Yeah, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool school autonomy ex-head teacher. I was a very early grant-maintained head. I can remember standing on a platform with my chair of governors and saying, whispering into her ear, behind us is the abyss. There is nothing else. But having then moved to be the inaugural school commissioner and then running an early chain, I know that the phrase earned autonomy, that
I think I coined in 2005-6 in the legislation that was on then, it is actually very important. Because I don't think it's something that can drop on people's shoulders and that they will run with. I have no idea how you train people to earn autonomy. I can't claim that I did that as the chief executive of a big multi-academy trust, but I do actually think that it is at the heart of what we're talking about here. The earned autonomy is an intensely creative experience, and if you get there, there can be no better job.
That's very interesting. Do you want to respond to what otherwise?
Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, so in response, okay, I'll start with future leaders. Firstly, I have some good news for you. I've done some analysis of the data on people who participated in the programs, and they do reliably move on into leadership positions, and they do so in schools that are significantly more disadvantaged than the national population. Saying that, of course, you have a good point in the sense of that there may be blockages in terms of making a career because you don't want to lose your best people to other places, and that's been something that has been a challenge for head teachers. I know in some schools where, okay, they've given people professional development and then they all go off. So I think here we do have a big advantage of the MAT model in the sense that you allow people to, you can allow people to move around within the MAT in the same way that is also an advantage. If you work in a fuller spur, you have better career opportunities than if you work in a single-owned for example, because you can move around and take on different positions. And I think the MAT model in that respect is pretty helpful. With regard to Deborah's comments, first of all, yeah, that idea of you have different types of schools is exactly the kind of thing I was referring to earlier, so that's very interesting. In terms of the longevity of principles, I do think that, I don't know much research about this. I do agree, however, that there is a problem that if you have somebody in position for a long time, the challenge from governors can sometimes become rather limited because this becomes a very kind of cozy relationship. The other side to that, however, is there is some research on systems that they use in a number of American school districts whereby they rotate principals every 3 years, and the disadvantage of doing that is that it is hard for principals to make changes and reforms because the teachers sit it out. They know in 3 years this one will be gone anyway. So I think it is hard to find a balance between maintaining the challenge that is required for somebody to keep performing optimally and not ending up in a situation whereby it becomes very difficult to make change because people are just waiting for you to go. So it's an interesting question. I also do think that for the persons themselves it may be useful to have a new challenge after a particular time. That's, then finally the issue of earned autonomy. Of course, I'm well familiar with the concept of earned autonomy. I think indeed that as an idea that definitely works. The question, as you yourself mentioned, is how do we develop it? So we can identify, I think we have good systems and you know better than anybody in terms of identifying when people are ready for that. But how do we actually develop people to work at the level that they do actually earn that autonomy? That's a challenge, and that's the part of the leadership development challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to sort of pick up on that as well, Bruce. I mean, that's obviously the principle was applied in a very different way with the first phase of academy sponsors under the initial reforms, and the meaning of it has changed a lot as well. So then we moved from one end of the spectrum to the other to outstanding and good schools, evidently having shown that they have earned it. to a much broader principle. I mean, I suppose another way, application. Another way of looking at it is actually training people. You know, coming at it from the other direction. We could talk about training people up in the use of autonomy, which is probably what we need to move to now. I mean, it sort of earned autonomy as a narrative, kind of worked at a system level. When you're talking about the trajectory of reform, that the system has, you know, has grown up, the structures have grown up. We have a system, whether it's got the right balance or not, that is both, you know, enjoys high levels of autonomy relative to other jurisdictions around the world, but also has central, you know, strong accountability as well. You know, so the system has earned autonomy, but now that we're sort of, you know, if not there, the path, you know, forward looks fairly clear that is, you know, the direction of travel. How do we train people up in actually how to use autonomy effectively now? That's a question that we are centrally applied to thinking about this in a longer term perspective. And it's pretty clear that as things stand at the moment, you know, leaders don't either are disincentivized in various ways from exercising the new areas of decision making, you know, sort of capacity that they have as a result of having changed status. They're also not incentivized to press, you know, so there are both disincentives and, you know, and a lack of incentives for them to actually press into that. So we don't see, you know, I'm not sure that we see much significant learning in the areas I outlined as being key to shifting upwards academic achievement. How much learning with what you can do with new autonomy have we actually really seen? And I think there's a role for government to look at why that's not happening. You know, at the pace that it's I think should be. Yes, Jonathan.
I kind of come to this as a relative new boy. I help schools all around the country recruit more students. I'm a marketing and business guy. And the first point is really that most of my life has been in the private sector, and they're the same problems and issues. So in one respect, are you overthinking and overcomplicating things? Because it all depends. Which leads me to the second point, and I engage a lot with the Department for Education, particularly in special educational needs, and other government departments. And I found that governments of all colours love silver bullets. They do not get that, and because they want a silver bullet, you look at the Children and Families Act and so forth, they actually could make it simple to cover 95%, but they want it to cover 100%. And that makes it incredibly complicated, turgid and involved. So I wonder, talking about the centralisation, you know, if in doubt, let's reorganise. And that's been going on for thousands of years. You know, if people are worried, they reorganise. I think it was Caius Petronius in 54 AD who said when there was a problem, they'd reorganise, and all that produced was confusion and disillusion.
I can tell which way you voted in the referendum. that indeed, from that remark, that indeed is the backdrop of our what the future next decades in our political system.
Confusion.
Well, no, you know, sort of, reorganisation. Take it down, dismantle, reorganise it again.
How much damage do you think governments do in this centralisation, silver bullet, and also they also want heroes. So you look at Kids Company. That is a classic example. The government loved Kids Company. They were the hero. They walked on water. The trustees stopped monitoring them close enough, and we see what happened.
Well, I think you know, if I might just answer that, you know, I think the only thing that we can do, I mean, I talk to people that have much greater longevity in policy than I do very often, and they're dismayed very often at the lack of learning at a political level that goes on, and the repetition, the same old stuff, that is why we're here. So we must become, he says, this is quite a place to end, an institution with longevity, because the purpose of organisations like this is actually, and a lot of research organisations and trusts with charitable initiatives and various briefs, is precisely to actually keep that, be an institution that holds on to that learning and keeps repeating it until hopefully somebody will actually pay attention and not repeat mistakes. I'm going to conclude it there because it is 10 to 8 and we do have some nice canapes and drinks waiting for those of you that can stay. I'm sure you're all very hungry now. I am. And so let's do that. But may I thank you all very much indeed for coming on this wet evening. And may I thank Daniel very much for his very insightful and helpful remarks, and you all for some excellent points raised in the discussion. And I hope we'll see you all again before too long at another of our events. Thank you. Funny and say that I'm not used to having a sponsor. It's true. Thank you very much to One Education for sponsoring this report. I certainly hope that when it's read at midnight tonight, before you go to sleep, that it meets expectations. And it'll be interesting to see what sort of conversation we have on that. Looking forward also to coming to Manchester to speak shortly. So, thank you all. Let's get a drink.